We left off last time talking about the Aryans. The Aryans originated in what is called the Yamnaya culture, which is a prehistoric culture without writing that was very warlike, that had mastered bronze smelting, that had mastered making bronze weapons and armor, and also the use of the chariot. The Yamnaya economy was based on cattle, so they followed large herds of cattle through the great pastures of what's now southern Russia, north of the Caucasus Mountains. And these were very warlike people. And the Yamnaya, we know they have the traits that we see in virtually all Indo-European language-based cultures. For example, there is a storm god that's prominent in their pantheon. If you look at, for example, both the Greeks and the Norse, two famous examples of European pagan mythology. You have Zeus, who is a storm god. You have Thor, who is a storm god. In virtually every Indo-European culture, a storm god plays a very, very, very prominent role. And that goes all the way back to the Yamnaya, whose chief deity was a storm god. The Yamnaya also featured the three-pronged form of government that is very common in Indo-European language-based cultures. For example, you will have a king or kings, group of kings. You'll have a council of elders, and you'll have a council of ordinary people. And this is something you can see in many Indo-European societies. Notable examples are, for example, in ancient Rome, you would have the consul, the executive. You would have the Senate, which was the council of nobles or elders. And then you would have the plebeians, the plebeian tribunes, who were the leaders of the ordinary people. And you can see that in ancient city-states throughout the Mediterranean, throughout Europe, and throughout the Middle East, wherever you have Indo-European peoples settling. So the Aryans, an offshoot of the Yamnaya, moved into the Indus River Valley, conquered the indigenous people, and led to what we now call the Vedic era, or Vedic period. The Vedic period is named such for the Vedas, which are ancient Hindu texts, sacred texts, that were written, that are considered foundational to Hinduism. Many of the pre-Aryan Harappan, Mohenjo-Daro, Indus River Valley civilizations' traits were adopted by the Aryans and integrated into a new culture, and the Aryans added traits of their own. Sometimes the two value systems collided and created something new, like, for example, with sacred cattle. The Aryans prized cattle above all other possessions, and in the traditional Indus River Valley civilization religion, bulls were considered sacred. So the fusion of these two cultures resulted in the creation of sacred cattle, the idea of cattle having of cattle being holy. And from that point on, while the Aryans originally ate the flesh of cows, over time they stopped doing this. They started to use the cows solely for milk, to have milk and cheese. The Aryans also adopted the caste system that had been developed in the Indus River Valley civilization. If you recall, the wells that people could use, the facilities that were available were based on your place in society, with the people at the very bottom, literally at the bottom of the terraced city, in kind of a literal underworld. These people were considered at the bottom of society and too impure to bathe in the great bath that existed in cities like Mohenjo-Daro. Well, the Aryans, once they arrived and conquered northwestern India, they began to set up their own version of this system, with themselves at the top, of course, with the Aryan tribes providing the Kshatriyas and the Brahmins, the two top castes, the warriors, rulers, and priests. Eventually, the different Aryan tribes coalesced into what is called the Kuru Kingdom. And the Kuru Kingdom began to expand to the east, in part due to the proliferation of iron weapons and tools. The Iron Age, the Aryans were among the earliest adopters of iron weaponry and tools, and so they were able to clear the vast jungles around the Ganges Plain very, 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 very effectively compared to the indigenous population whom they subjugated. And here I have a statue of the ancient Aryan warrior Arjuna. Arjuna is an important figure in what's called the Bhagavad Gita. We'll talk more about that in a moment. He was one of the greatest warriors of his era, and he took part in a civil war between the various Aryan tribes. And it's that civil war that forms the basis of the Mahabharata, one of the most important works of Hindu literature. The Vedic literature of this time period would have an enormous impact on the future of not just India, but the entirety of the Asian continent, due to Hinduism sharing a common foundation with Buddhism. The two greatest epic poems of the Vedic era were the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is an account of a civil war in the Kuru Kingdom between the different Aryan factions. And the Ramayana is a chronicle of the exploits of the great hero Rama. Both the Mahabharata and the Ramayana were originally transmitted orally. Eventually they were written down in Sanskrit, which is a language that descended from the ancient Indo-Aryan speech. Sanskrit being a holy language not just of Hinduism, but later on Buddhism as well. The most famous part of the Mahabharata is called the Bhagavad Gita. And in the Bhagavad Gita, there is a dialogue between the great warrior hero Arjuna and the god Krishna, who is an incarnation of the god Vishnu. And by incarnation, we mean he's a form of Vishnu. If you remember, you have Vishnu, the preserver, Brahma, the creator, Shiva, the destroyer. That's the Trimurti, the three great major gods of virtually every faction of Hinduism. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna had a major problem. He was a warrior, he was part of the Kshatriya caste, and he was meant to go out and fight. The problem was that this was a civil war, and many of those on the other side were his cousins, friends, mentors, etc. And he didn't want to go out and essentially kill his own people. Well, the god Krishna, who appeared to Arjuna, told him, don't worry about that. Don't worry about your personal familial obligations. Right now you need to worry about your dharma, what your duty is, and what your caste is. Focus on that, and then everything else will sort itself out. And so that's a fundamental precept of Hindu belief that carried over into Buddhism. Even though Buddhism is casteless, this emphasis on dharma above all else remained. And this emphasis on dharma, on duty, over family ties is something that was tremendous, of tremendous significance, because family ties are so critical in virtually all of Monsoon Asia. So that a value that could transcend your familial obligations was something that was quite revolutionary at the time in Indian civilization. In order to discuss the post-Vedic period in Indian history, we really need to take a look outside of Monsoon Asia. And the reason for this is because this period was influenced greatly by a non-Indian, Alexander the Great. Alexander had inherited the throne of Macedonia from his father, Philip. The Macedonians were kind of like the country cousins of the ancient Greeks. They spoke Greek. They had essentially Greek values, though they were considered rustic by the more urbane southern Greeks. Philip, the king of Macedon, Alexander's father, conquered the Greek city-states, and so he handed the entire Greek world over to his son when he passed away. And Alexander wanted to be like Achilles, the great hero of the Mycenaean Greeks during the Trojan War. Alexander wanted to achieve the same kind of fame as Achilles, and the way he wanted to do this was through the conquest of the known world. That's why he's referred to as Alexander the Great, due to the fact that he carved out the largest empire up to that point in time. Alexander invaded the much larger Persian Empire to the east and defeated the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, and then absorbed the entire Persian Empire, which extended all the way to northwestern India. Alexander originally wanted to go deep into India and to conquer the entire, what he viewed as the edge of the world. His campaign in India began in 327 BC, 4 years after he had defeated Darius, and he eventually crossed the Indus River and defeated a great king named Porus. Porus obviously is a Greek name. That would not have been the actual name of the Indian king. Unfortunately, we don't know the name of the Indian king. We do know that Alexander had a coin struck which shows him on horseback fighting against Porus, who is riding an elephant, which had long since been domesticated by the various Aryan tribes who had gone into India. This influence went beyond that of just Alexander and Porus, though. Indian culture and Greek culture began an exchange that would profoundly influence both civilizations. For one, the Greek ideas of government, Greek ideas about particularly aesthetics, the Greek emphasis on anatomical correctness in art was something that began to influence Indian artists. Similarly, this idea that with Alexander wasn't just a great warrior, he was also an intellectual. He had been educated by the famous Greek philosopher Aristotle, who taught him his methods of observing and understanding the natural world, basically the basis of Western science. And that also began to influence how Indians looked at the natural world. The Platonic ideas about the world of forms, which we won't go into detail here, that began to influence religious thinking. So you end up with this idea of the world as a giant illusion. That's something that was part of Platonic philosophy from the Greek philosopher Plato that would have a profound influence on the thinking of Buddhism. And though we're focused primarily on history of Asia, obviously, this term is important to know: Hellenism, the spread of Greek culture. And this is something that isn't just confined to India, but to Persia, to Egypt, throughout what we would call the Middle East. Greek culture had a predominant influence from the time of the death of Alexander all the way into the Roman Empire. Yet, as I stated earlier, Indian culture profoundly influenced the Greek world as well, particularly when it comes to mathematics and engineering. Regarding mathematics and urban planning, Indian civilization remained far ahead of the civilizations of the rest of the world. And this is something that would continue throughout the next millennium and beyond. In fact, the very concept of zero was first invented by an Indian monk, the Hindu monk Brahmagupta, in 628. He was the first to use a concrete symbol indicating nothing, a value of nothing. And one interesting detail is that the number system that we use today worldwide, they're called technically Arabic numerals. This is because they entered into Western Europe and into England from Spain, particularly from Islamic Spain, and they were associated with Arabs, but the actual numerical system was invented by Indians, and the Arabs were kind of the middlemen in spreading that numerical system into Europe. So we actually owe our entire mathematical system to the medieval Indians. Now let's jump back to a focus more exclusively on India. When Alexander died at a young age, his empire was divided between his generals. One of the Indians whom Alexander greatly influenced was named Chandragupta. And there is a legend that Chandragupta actually met Alexander when Chandragupta was younger. We don't know if this was in fact true, but we do know that he emulated Alexander's campaign of conquest. Chandragupta began his reign by overthrowing a small kingdom, the Nanda kingdom, and then beginning a campaign of conquest in northwestern India, where in the wake of Alexander's withdrawal, there was political chaos. So Chandragupta had a much easier time kind of breaking up the remnants of Alexander's satraps and the native rulers who were still in place. We call Chandragupta's empire the Maurya Empire after his surname. This would be the largest of the Indian empires, with the most of the subcontinent subjugated prior to the peak of the British Empire in the 19th century. In his later years, with his campaigns of conquest complete, Chandragupta turned to asceticism. By asceticism, we mean a life of self-denial, of religious-inspired self-denial. He began to engage in a denial of eating meat, even though he was of the Kshatriya caste. He began to deeply take on ascetic spiritual practices. The Maurya Empire continued to expand after Chandragupta's death. It would be his grandson, Ashoka, who would lead the Maurya Empire to its greatest territorial extent. And like his grandfather, Chandragupta, Ashoka would also embrace asceticism and become deeply, deeply religious. Ashoka, like his grandfather, began his reign as a great conqueror. He conquered much of the subcontinent that Chandragupta had not been able to reach, including the kingdom of Kalinga in the east. Kalinga contained the famous city of Orissa, or Odisha, and the savagery there was so intense, with so many civilian casualties and so much destruction, that Ashoka, according to Buddhist tradition, was deeply, deeply moved by this, converted to Buddhism, and devoted to spend the rest of his reign spreading righteousness instead of war. Ashoka began to promulgate edicts favorable to Buddhists and Buddhism. We call these the Rock Edicts. They also exhorted the people to what he considered righteous behavior, to create a more moral society where people treated one another better and followed the Dharma in the hopes of reaching enlightenment at the end of life, which is something we talked about in the Hinduism-Buddhism lecture, if you remember. All in all, according to Buddhist tradition, Ashoka is said to have constructed 84,000 shrines and pagodas of the Buddhist tradition, Buddhist places of prayer. And while some of them are quite small, consisting of a few benches and an altar, some of them are extremely large. And this is quite a feat that he was able to do this. It's a testament to both his faith and his power. Ashoka also sent missionaries south to Sri Lanka and east into Southeast Asia, what's now Myanmar / Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, etc. And this would be one of the most profound effects of his reign and of the Mauryan Empire in general.